Hello, all you pod people. Welcome back to Mad Cardigan Crime. I'm your host, Brian. In the extremely unlikely case you missed my first episode on that little shithead Albert Fish, my podcast focuses on true crime analysis from the perspective of an old cop with questionable credentials and opinions. Speaking of that first episode, I humbly apologize for the production quality. It was my first foray into podcasting, and I'm learning as I go. But grab my hand and stick with me. It'll get better, and we'll make it through this. Now let's just quickly hit my podcast checklist and make sure I'm prepared. Got my cardigan on? Check. Got a double whiskey sitting next to me? Check. I'm naked from the waist down? Double check. Calm down. Just kidding on the last one. Of course I'm wearing my boxers, you pervs. Now, unless you're one of those old people porn aficionados out there, you may now be thinking, great, I've tuned into the weird guy. But let me assure you, I am just attempting to desensitize you to the weirdness we're about to get our shoes sticky trudging through, or soften the blow, so to speak. So today, we're off to where palm trees grow tall and the weather is always warm, Wisconsin. We're going to meet a nice, polite young man who's really into arts and crafts. His sense of smell is somewhat underdeveloped, but who are we to judge? I'd like to introduce you to Jeffrey the Zombie Maker Dahmer. He's more widely known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, but I like my nickname better. I mean, shit, in these podcasts, who the hell isn't a cannibal? Let's start talking about his early life, some of the things that made up his, not so much persona, but, you know, his psychological makeup for later down the line. One of the key things I noticed in researching him was he was allowed to choose his younger brother's name when he was born, and Dahmer chose David. Now, most of you know Michelangelo's statue of David is a young, well-formed, nude male. Now, this is probably just coincidence, but it just struck me as something that would come later in life with Jeffrey's sexual preferences, so to speak. Jeffrey had a fascination with animal bones, like roadkill, just finding dead animals in the woods and stuff, and he would refer to these as fiddlesticks. Now, he was living in Bath Township, Ohio in 1968. This was his sixth address in 8.5 years. So, I mean, they moved around a lot, okay? This place in Bath was 1.5 wooded acres with a small removed hut. Now, Jeffrey used this hut to collect bugs and animal skeletons. He began to have a sexual interest in objects, okay? He would keep some of the remains in jars of formaldehyde, just like Silence of the Lambs stuff. Now, one time during a dinner with his family, having some chicken, Jeff asked his father, Lionel, about bleaching animal bones. Now, Lionel, his father, was a chemist, or I believe at this time a chemist in training. He was still getting his higher education. And he loved Jeffrey's interest in science, and he taught him how to, bleach bones. He thought it was just a healthy thing. Now, dissecting roadkill and the interest in how things fit together was one of Dahmer's big things when he was little, when he was a child. He would bury animals next to that hut with skulls on makeshift crosses, so tiny little graves. He had a little pet cemetery, so to speak. Now, he had no qualms handling dead, rotting things, which would make us gag, or most children gag, or they would recoil from. So this was a strange thing in his psychological makeup right from the beginning. At 15 years old, he decapitated a dog carcass and nailed it to a tree with the head on a stick in the woods right behind the house. Now, he took one of his friends and he showed him as a quote-unquote prank and claimed he just found it. He didn't put it there. Now, was he probing for shock, as some kids do, like a practical joke, or was this the beginning of some type of sexual gratification? Now, he was 15 years old, so he would have been well into the hormones, so who knows? Or was he possibly ashamed since he didn't claim it? Just trying to see how others would react to what he was doing. Now, at 14, he began drinking beer and liquor during daylight hours. I mean, like drinking at 14 in the evening is okay. That was a strange sentence I read. I mean, shit, I drink during the day. You know, he would conceal the scotch in his coat and drank during morning class. I didn't take it that far. He told a classmate it was his medicine. Now, Dahmer was seen by adults as polite and intelligent, but he had average grades, probably wasn't really trying, he wasn't really interested in school, and being drunk half the time couldn't help. Now, he was showing compartmentalization and false faces for authorities, good traits of a sociopath, you know, somebody that can show you one thing and be another, which he would really do in later life. His homosexuality, when he was in his early teens, you know, he discovered this, or he began having, you know, inklings of it. He hid it from his parents. You know, we're talking 60s and 70s, wasn't highly, you know, accepted back then. His dad, Lionel, seemed to be a very conservative type. Now, his mom was described as heavily medicated, you know, hypochondriacal, depressive. And his father was a distant career scientist. So he had a brief physical relationship with another boy, but I don't believe there was any actual sexual contact. But this was kind of the start of the homosexual career, or him discovering, you know, his sexual preferences here. Now, since none of this stuff was healthy with all the animals and, you know, the dead things and all that kind of stuff, and he wasn't having a normal, or couldn't have a normal relationship with another male partner, you know, his fantasies about dominating a submissive, non-interactive partner, and he would focus on the chest and torsos, this kind of became his thing. He associated with a dissection. You know, he had things he could fiddle with, things he could mess with without them objecting, okay? You know, he's most engaged and aroused with dead objects that don't object. Now, at 16, he had a fantasy about immobilizing this athletic jogger that ran near his house, I'm assuming on a trail maybe, with a baseball bat. You know, he wanted to knock him out so that he could just have a unconscious male partner that he could do whatever he wanted with. He actually hid in the bushes, you know, with the bat, but the jogger didn't appear on that day, and thankfully he didn't reattempt. He only tried that one time. This was an impromptu thing. He was 16 years old, impulsive, you know, not looking ahead, not thinking. So, you know, it was just an impulse, and thankfully he didn't actually act on it. Now, as high school progressed, Dahmer was viewed as a class clown. You know, he would do things like bleeding like an animal or have fake seizures for attention. The other students called it doing a Dahmer. Now, lowered inhibitions from alcohol consumption, you know, that probably helped him act out with the other kids and stuff. And he would actually sometimes do these stunts and stuff for money, which he would use to buy more alcohol. And as he approached the end of high school, his grades declined. Obviously, you're drunk at school, you know, you're not going to be paying much attention. So, and his bad home life, you know, had always been, you know, his mother and father fought like cats and dogs, from what I understand. Lionel had found out that Jeffrey's mother, Joyce, had a brief affair, and so they eventually divorced. And Lionel moved out of the house to a motel. Okay. So the divorce was finalized just as Dahmer graduated high school. Now, his mother took Jeffrey's younger brother, David, and moved to relatives in Wisconsin. Remember, they're in Ohio at this time. And she didn't tell Lionel. And Dahmer basically had the house to himself with nothing to do. So his dad's in a motel thinking that his mother and his younger brother are still, or his wife and his younger son are still living in the house, which they weren't. They had left. So this all leads up to the first murder. It's always got to be a first, right? So on June 18th, 1978, just 3 weeks after he graduated high school, I guess he was giving himself a graduation present, sounds like, Dahmer's absolute lack of supervision, and this must be new to him, you know, so intensely hormonal 18-year-old boy who should be chasing girls or boys, whatever your preference is, you know, he's just been let loose with no supervision. So now he has an opportunity to make years of fantasy real. Okay, he wants a submissive, unconscious partner. Okay, so he's out driving. I imagine in a Chevy Nova or something back from the 70s. Okay, a Ford Pinto maybe. He picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, who, by the way, was shirtless when he was hitchhiking. And as you know, from most of these 70s and 80s serial killer podcasts that you probably listened to in the past, hitchhiking was a common thing and extremely dangerous. You know today how dangerous these things are. You know, we've learned from the past. I remember when I was young and I would be driving with my parents and stuff in the 70s, and we passed multiple hitchhikers. You know, and we lived in multiple places across the country, so it wasn't just a regional thing. We never stopped to pick anybody up, but, you know, and I never thought anything about it at the time. But these days, oh my gosh, hitchhiking, you're crazy to hitchhike. So, back to Stephen Hicks. Hicks was on his way to a concert, got picked up by Dahmer, but Dahmer offered him a few beers, and I guess Hicks thought that was a better deal. You know, go back to this kid's house and have some free liquor, you know. Now, Hicks immediately started making comments about girls, and this told Dahmer that he was not going to be able to make real sexual advances on him. At least he was thinking about trying to make normal sexual advances. So they drank and listened to music for several hours before Hicks wanted to leave. You know, obviously he'd gotten his alcohol and might have been getting some strange vibes from Dahmer. Now, Dahmer stated he wanted to keep him from leaving. He wanted him to stay, didn't want him to leave. So while Hicks was seated in a chair, Dahmer came up behind him with a metal 10-pound dumbbell and struck him in the back of the head twice. After Hicks was incapacitated on the ground, Dahmer obviously realized, okay, I've done this. It's time to go all the way. So then Dahmer strangled him with the bar of the dumbbell, put it across his windpipe. Dahmer then had his submissive partner, and he explored Hicks's chest and torso before masturbating over the corpse. And hours later, he dragged the body into the basement. Now, that was his first foray. It was messy. You know, he didn't know what to do. You know, you'll see as serial killers, most serial killers, they perfect their craft, so to speak, or whatever you want to call it, as they go along. It's trial and error. Okay, so this was a quick thing. He knocked him out, got a good look at the torso, and masturbated. No actual sexual contact with the corpse. So the next day, Dahmer dissected the body and buried it in the backyard. Now, weeks later, he exhumed this body and stripped the flesh from the bones. I don't know if this was just because he wanted the bones, or he was trying to more completely get rid of evidence. Now, he dissolved the flesh in acid and flushed it down the toilet. He crushed and pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer and then scattered them in the woods behind the house. So he obliterated Stephen Hicks. He threw Hicks's necklace and the knife he used to dissect him in the West Bath Road Bridge into the Cuyahoga River. For his first murder, he was extremely thorough in disposing of the body, but it took weeks to do so. You know, it wasn't a do it and get rid of the body quickly type thing. He had to actually sit and think about this. And you don't always have the time, or the killers don't always have the time to think these things through so carefully. Let's move on to his college days, okay? Now, 6 weeks after Hicks's murder, Dahmer's father returned home with his new fiancée. He figured out Dahmer was living there by himself. So he was probably surprised to find Jeffrey living there, or living alone in the house. Now, that August, Dahmer enrolled in Ohio State, and he was majoring in business. Mostly because of his alcohol abuse, Dahmer finished the first semester with a whopping 0.45 GPA. I remember having a 0.2 as one of my GPAs, and I thought that was bad. But a 0.45, that's really bad. Now, his only passing grade was a B- in riflery, of all things. Now, could you imagine teaching firearms to school today? Yeah, that's not going to fly. Or hell, I don't know. There may actually be places out there that do teach it in college. Now, despite Dahmer's father having paid for the next semester in advance, he dropped out after only 3 months. So college, wasn't for him, not like high school was. So Lionel's next suggestion was for Dahmer to enlist in the U.S. Army, where he would train as a medical specialist. So anatomy, it's fantastic. Now, even during the training phase of his military service, Dahmer was reprimanded multiple times for alcohol abuse. After basic training, the leash is loosened and privates are allowed out a bit, when they go to their tech schools and stuff. Now, an act of insubordination by Dahmer got his entire platoon punished. Now, this earned him a beating from the other recruits. I don't know if you all have seen Full Metal Jacket with the bar soap party, the soap and the socks. I don't know if it was that, but he pissed off the rest of his platoon and he got a whooping for it. And after his training, Dahmer was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, as a combat medic. Now, he was reviewed as an average soldier. He wasn't great, wasn't horrible. Now, within 2 years of enlisting, his chronic alcohol abuse caused his superiors to deem him unsuitable for military service. Now, that still comes with an honorable discharge. It's just a polite way of saying they didn't want to deal with him anymore. Now, I've seen a photo of Dahmer passed out on a bunk with his pants undone shortly after arriving in Germany. So he was the object of fun, let's put it that way, probably with his other platoon and his the guys that lived in his barracks and stuff. So after they deemed him unsuitable, he was processed out through Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Now, I actually went to basic training in Fort Jackson, and all I remember about that place was it was hot. And that he was given a plane ticket to anywhere in the U.S. Now, because Dahmer was too ashamed to face his father, he said he was tired of the cold. He asked for a ticket to Miami Beach, Florida. Dahmer found a job in a deli and stayed in a nearby motel. Since, obviously he's going to spend all his money on alcohol, he was soon thrown out for not paying rent. After spending a few nights on the beach, which sleeping in the sand, that's got to be fun, Dahmer finally decided to call Daddy and ask for a ticket home. So him being on his own, wasn't working out too well. Now, after he returned home to Ohio, Dahmer continued to drink heavily, and within 2 weeks, he was arrested for drunken disorderly conduct. Lionel was unable to wean Jeffrey off alcohol, and as a last-ditch effort, he sent him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. It seems his grandmother was the only family member Dahmer had ever shown any affection to. Now, initially, Dahmer, he seemed to improve while living under grandmother's roof. He would attend church and got a job as a phlebotomist, which deals with blood, at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. He was laid off after 10 months. He had continued to drink all this time and remain unemployed for 2 years after the layoff. I don't think he was fired for doing anything strange. It was just a typical layoff at that point. So maybe he enjoyed drawing blood. Who knows? Now, in August of '82, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure at Wisconsin State Fair Park. Supposedly, he had not committed a violent or sexually oriented crime in a few years. Now that he was not strictly controlled and supervised, the fantasies came creeping back. He's not in the military. There's not somebody watching him all the time. So, in January of '85, Dahmer got a night job as a mixer for the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. Now, around this time, an incident occurred at the public library which steered Dahmer back towards his fantasy life. A strange man passed him a note offering fellatio. Dahmer didn't accept. I picture a fat balding guy in an overcoat, the typical flasher, but he did begin to seek out the gay culture in Milwaukee. Now, this included going to gay bars, adult bookstores, and bathhouses. Now, as he began to frequent these bathhouses, looking for sexual partners, he described them as relaxing places for him. He began to dislike the fact that his partner was an actual moving participant in the sex act. He never lost that fantasy of having a completely submissive and compliant partner, thinking back to Stephen Hicks. He wasn't satisfied with the normal processes that occurred in these places, so he made adjustments. He laced alcohol with sedatives and fed it to his potential partner, and now after the man became unconscious, Dahmer had his ideal partner and did whatever he wanted. Now, obviously, after this was reported about a dozen times to management, They revoked Dahmer's membership to the bathhouse. Dahmer then moved his operation to motel rooms and kept his sedative supply full by lying to doctors about his inability to sleep because he worked a night shift. He was arrested again for lewd and lascivious behavior, in which he was masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys at the, I can't even pronounce this, Kinnickinnick River. There's a lot of K's and N's in there. They're great names. He kept skirting the line between men and boys, preferring smooth athletic torsos like the Statue of David, and not common with males, later in life. I mean, I don't have a smooth chest, so he was sentenced to probation and counseling for this offense. Now, Dahmer did two other odd things around this time, somewhat suggesting he didn't want to kill anyone to satisfy his sexual urges. He wasn't fully committed to that yet. He stole a store mannequin, and put it, in a closet for sexual stimulation until Grandma found it and demanded to be thrown away. That'd be a weird thing. Grandma opens the closet and there's a store mannequin staring at her, covered in God knows what. Now, he also read about an upcoming funeral for an 18-year-old boy. He fantasized about keeping the body for his own use and actually attempted to dig him up. Now, after finding the ground was too hard, he gave up. Wasn't that committed? And is not as determined as Mr. Ed Gein, if any of you know who he was. In November of '87, Dahmer met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a bar and convinced him to come back to the room he had rented at the Ambassador Hotel. Dahmer stated he had not intended to kill Twomey, but drug him as he had done in the bathhouses. And who knows how many times, Dahmer had done this in between. Dahmer supposedly hadn't killed in almost a decade at this point. Nevertheless, he woke up the next day to a dead Twomey. Twomey's chest had been crushed in, and he was black and blue with bruises. Dahmer stated his fist and forearm were also heavily bruised, but he didn't remember anything. I tend to believe him, since this was not the ideal place for body disposal, and checkout time was coming up, so I don't think he intended to kill this guy. Now, Dahmer purchased a large suitcase and transported Twomey's body to his grandmother's house, where he has time to think about it. A week later, Dahmer began the disposal process. So this guy's been in a suitcase for a week. He dismembered the body, stripped the flesh from the bones, and put the flesh in garbage bags. He then wrapped the bones in a sheet and pulverized them again with a sledgehammer. He simply disposed of all the remains in the garbage can, and just hoped the garbage men didn't notice when they put it out. Now, he kept Twomey's severed head, however. This is the first human trinket he was keeping, a trophy. Now, he had plans for it. After 2 weeks of having it wrapped in a blanket, Dahmer boiled Twomey's head in a mixture of industrial detergent and bleach. Back to his chemist roots. He did this in an attempt to preserve the skull as a masturbation trophy for himself. However, the process made the skull brittle, and Dahmer was eventually forced to pulverize and dispose of it as well. Now, he has his father's love of chemistry, just not the talent for it. He was kind of winging it, so to speak. Now, by Dahmer's own admission, the Twomey killing was a turning point for him. He had tried less extreme methods of satisfying his sexual fantasies, but now he's deciding to go all in. He would now begin to actively hunt for victims. That means when he leaves, he's going to get someone to kill. It doesn't just happen. Now, I think Dahmer, he's mainly a product killer as opposed to the process one. He didn't seem to enjoy the hurting or the killing of another, and only saw it as a means to get his product, the body, or a completely submissive partner. Now, Grandma's cellar is something to be talked about. Now, Dahmer, he somehow found a way around Grandmother's supervision and made her new home his killing ground. The Twomey killing had shown him a motel room was not the ideal place for his upcoming practices. 2 months later, Dahmer met James Dockstader, a 14-year-old Native American prostitute. He lured James home with an offer he would begin to use regularly, $50 to pose for nude photos. That was a lot of money back then. Now, after having sex, Dahmer drugged James and strangled him on the cellar floor. Again, he left the body there for a week before dismembering and disposing of it, minus the head, of course. Not sure of the reason for the week's delay again. Maybe he just didn't want to deal with it. But Grandma's schedule, or, I don't know how she doesn't realize there's a dead body in the cellar. She just doesn't get down there, I guess. I really don't think he enjoyed the process of this. Now, as I've said, I'm not a doctor, but I'm not sure of the benefit of waiting a week. Maybe it's less bloody. Maybe everything's congealed. Who knows? It sure as hell can't smell better. That's for sure. Now, he again attempted to boil the head in bleach, minus the industrial detergent this time, but again, it became brittle from the process and had to be disposed of. In March of 1988, Dahmer met 22-year-old bisexual Richard Guerrero outside a gay bar called the Phoenix. He lured him back to Grandma's house, promising $50 for sex. He drugged him with sleeping pills, strangled him with a leather strap, and filleted the corpse. Okay, so now he actually is abusing the corpse itself. Now, he offered to pay for the sex instead of photography, so he's kind of bringing people back that he already knows are going to be interested in sexual contact. And he strangled him with a predetermined tool this time, the strap, instead of whatever he had at hand, the dumbbell, which he just picked up, or bare hands. And strangling somebody with your bare hands can take, 20 minutes. It takes a long time to strangle someone. Not that I've ever done it myself. And he had actual necrophiliac sex with the corpse instead of just masturbating. Okay, so all of these things are pointing to refining his fantasy, okay? This is a process of perfecting the things that go through his head on a daily basis. He dismembered and disposed of the body in the trash within 24 hours and retained the skull. Now, this time, obviously, it only took hours instead of a week to do the chore. This lessened the chance of discovery since Grandma had to be coming and going at this point. He still used the trash since it was convenient and he hadn't been caught yet. I kept the skull for months instead of days, so his preservation style is obviously improving. In April of 1988, Dahmer lured Ronald Flowers Jr. to his grandma's house. After giving Flowers a sedative-laced coffee, Dahmer's grandma this time observed that Jeffrey had company. The discovery didn't prevent Flowers from drinking the coffee and passing out, though. It did save his life, as Dahmer knew his grandma was there, and she knew he was there. So Dahmer was afraid to kill him and instead took him to County General Hospital. Dropped him off, okay? Now, this discovery by his grandmother seemed to slow Dahmer's almost monthly killing habit at this point. He'd been getting comfortable and his behavior was escalating. The time in between the cooling off period was shortening. So Grandma probably saved a few lives here. In September of 1988, Dahmer's grandmother, she'd had enough and asked him to move out. All the drinking, and she obviously saw there was a few other late-night strange male visitors. He may not have killed them all. And as you can imagine, many strange smells coming from the basement or the cellar caused her decision to kick him out. So on September 25th, Dahmer moved into a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street. Now Dahmer had his own space again. Okay, so he immediately resumed his deviant behavior. He had no supervision, and he had a lair at this point. As luck immediately ran out. 2 days after moving in, Dahmer was arrested for drugging and fondling a 13-year-old boy who he had lured to the apartment for nude photography. Now, most parents don't want to believe their children are capable of anything bad, and Lionel was no different. Now, he hired attorney Gerald Boyle to defend Jeffrey. Being a well-educated, fact-based person, I believe Lionel already admitted to himself that something was seriously wrong with Jeffrey, but he still had to help his blood however he could. Now, the attorney ordered psychiatric evaluations for Jeffrey. In a serious case involving a child, this is standard defense tactic. But I also think Lionel was advising Boyle on Jeffrey's past behaviors. He was trying to head this off at the pass. Now, the evaluation showed Dahmer to be an alienated, isolated person with poor impulse control. No kidding. An earlier diagnosis of a schizoid personality disorder were also introduced. Now, this is simply another way of saying alienated and isolated. Don't make the mistake. This is not schizophrenia, okay? This is a schizoid personality disorder. It's just a separated personality disorder. Now, I think of Dahmer's diagnosis like this. A trapdoor spider, okay, hides from the world in a hole that he creates for himself. But when he gets an unsuspecting victim into his isolated lair, the lack of impulse control or hunger kicks in and all bets are off. Now, after he consumes a few victims, that isolated lair starts to become crowded with their remains. Now, before this story is over, you'll get what I'm saying. In January of 1989, Dahmer pleaded guilty to second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. His sentencing, however, was suspended until May. During this time, Dahmer moved back into his grandmother's house. Among other reasons, the apartment was now on police radar and thus not a suitable lair. Now, in March, just 2 months before his sentencing, Dahmer's lack of impulse control showed itself again when he took his fifth victim, Anthony Sears, a 24-year-old aspiring model who made the mistake of talking to Dahmer at closing time in the gay bar. Dahmer later asserted he was not looking for a victim that night, but Sears just started talking to him. Strange place to be for a man about to be sentenced for a sexual crime. Sitting in his established hunting ground. And yet he blames the victim for basically forcing him to kill him by talking to him. It's his classic displacement. Dahmer took Sears back to Grandma's house and they engaged in oral sex before Dahmer drugged and strangled him. The next morning, Dahmer began his normal disposal technique, but this time he began to deviate and experiment. He stated he had found Sears exceptionally attractive and took pains to permanently retain parts of him. Dahmer stored Sears' head and genitals in acetone and placed them in a wooden box. He kept his head intact and didn't try to deflesh the skull. He placed the box in his work locker. He still worked at the chocolate factory and decided that would be a better hiding place than his grandmother's house prior to his upcoming sentencing. Me personally, I would have got rid of everything, but this guy really likes these trophies. I assume his lawyer had advised him on the probable sentencing coming up, maybe through an agreement with the prosecutor. Considering where he stored Sears' remains, he must have known he was keeping his job. And sure enough, the sentence of 1 year in prison with work release and 5 years probation was handed down. As is usual for docile cowards who don't cause trouble, Dahmer didn't even serve his full sentence. Now, I'm not saying that good behavior in prison is a bad thing. I use the words docile coward to describe a multiple murder and pedophile, the worst of the worst, who doubtfully even met the gaze even of petty criminals in that establishment. After his release, he temporarily moved back in with Grandma. With all of Dahmer's previous behavior under her roof now combined with his criminal behavior, I bet she'd reached the end of her rope with the parolee. He would not be staying long. In May of 1990, Dahmer moved into the apartment he would soon not just make famous, he would make it infamous. 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213. After moving into the shiny new lair, Dahmer showed it off to his two best buddies. Anthony Sears' now mummified head and genitals. The spider's home already had its first remains, and he hadn't even killed anyone here, yet. Dahmer's apartment was perfect for him. It was cheap, very close to his work, and best of all, it was in the type of neighborhood where most people minded their own business and didn't want to know you. Sears' remains only entertained Dahmer for about a week. He then took his sixth victim, 32-year-old Raymond Smith, Smith was a prostitute and Dahmer offered him $50 for sex. After arriving at Dahmer's apartment, Smith was given a drink laced with 7 sleeping pills and then strangled. The next step in escalating and perfecting his fantasy had Dahmer buying a Polaroid camera the next day. Dahmer began taking photos of Smith's body in suggestive positions. Going back to Dahmer being a product killer, Dahmer knew he couldn't keep an entire body for any length of time, so this was his first idea at bridging that gap. I mean, he's basically just handing it to investigators later in life. Just evidence on top of evidence here. Now, trophies like these are not uncommon with serial killers. Many have been caught with their victims' personal items, either like ID cards maybe, or jewelry, etc. Dahmer would take trophy collecting to a whole new level though. After the photo shoot, Dahmer began a revised disposal process. In addition to dismembering and boiling remains in industrial detergent, Dahmer now used acid in a large container to dissolve some parts. As he had done before, Dahmer retained the skull, and this time he spray painted it before storing it on a black towel in a filing cabinet. Only 1 week later, showing massive escalation, Dahmer brought another victim home. I guess the reason we don't know his name is because he escaped. Dahmer had accidentally drank the sedative-laden drink and passed out. The lucky guy then robbed Dahmer of his cash, some clothing, and a watch. In the upcoming years, I hope that young man discovered how close he had come to a horrible death. Hopefully he didn't pawn the watch. Oh, and by the way, Dahmer did not call the police to his apartment to report the crime. I mean, no shit, right? Since by this time, Dahmer had sufficient trophies for his masturbatory fantasies, why the quick escalation into killing only days apart? I mean, you can speculate this is one of those times when the killer begins to feel guilt and wants to get caught. I mean, he must have been aware that aside from the fact that he was filling his apartment with partial human remains, traces of those remains were escaping in the form of odors. Now, personally, having lived in other countries with other cultures, I can tell you when you're immersed and confronted, by, shall we say, culinary odors you've never experienced, they can span a huge spectrum, from unknown but pleasant to holy shit, what is that? Now, for example, I loved my time in South Korea. I lived there for a year. And their people are fantastic. But whoever invented kimchi should get a stern talking to. Now, for those of you that don't know, kimchi is in essence fermenting or decomposing cabbage. Now, I realize that is a gross oversimplification, but that's where my interest in it and understanding ends. Now, I know many non-Korean people who love kimchi, but I guess I just never developed an appreciation for decaying vegetable matter. Now, like most gastronomically challenged Americans, when I smell something like that in my fridge, it goes straight to the trash, and that trash goes straight to the garbage bin, and that garbage bin goes straight to the curb. Now, in most cases, this is strictly a cultural thing, and Dahmer lived in a cramped apartment building, surrounded on all sides by other cultures. When you're in that environment and your neighbors, who have smelled most everything, begin to complain, you have taken your smells to another level. Now, smells aside, I believe this is where Jeffrey begins to seriously think about his arts and crafts, which I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. He is now stockpiling materials for something bigger and becoming a quote-unquote collector, if you can think of that title in its most disgusting form. Okay, let's continue. In June of 1990, Dahmer lured 27-year-old Edward Smith to his lair. Sources label Edward as an acquaintance of Dahmer. This is obviously either a lack of judgment by Dahmer or sheer laziness in obtaining a victim. When you know your victim, even just as a passing acquaintance, your probability of detection increases exponentially. Now, bad decisions and laziness aside, poor Edward suffered the same fate as so many before him, drugging and strangulation. Dahmer continued to try and refine his science of preservation. After defleshing the skeleton, instead of pulverizing or using acid to destroy it, Dahmer put it in the freezer for a few months to see if it would retain moisture. Now, you can give Dahmer an A for effort, but he was by no means a genius or even knowledgeable in these matters. The skeleton not only retained moisture and had to ultimately be destroyed like the others when he put the skull into the oven and dry it. Yep, you guessed it, it exploded. Now, being killed or caught because of an exploding oven would have been a best-case scenario here, especially for Dahmer's future victims. His ultimate demise would be much more poetic, shall we say, trust me. Now, less than 3 months after the Edwards killing, and presumably while his skeleton was drying in the freezer, Dahmer lured 22-year-old Ernest Miller to his lair for the customary $50. Once there, Miller allowed Dahmer to indulge his fetish with torsos and listen to his heart and stomach. When Dahmer attempted to perform oral sex on Miller, he was informed that would cost extra. Now, this snapped Dahmer back to his disgusting reality, and he instead prepared Miller a drug-laced drink. In this case, however, Dahmer only had 2 sleeping pills, which we've heard in the past he used up to 7. And it didn't render Miller completely unconscious. So Dahmer simply used his dissection knife to cut Miller's carotid artery and watch him bleed to death. Dahmer then posed Miller's body for another photo shoot before moving him to the bathtub for dissection. Dahmer cut off Miller's head first. He then kissed and talked to the severed head while dismembering the rest of the body. That's not strange at all. I guess anything he could do to make the detestable chore more bearable. It's horrible, but my mind keeps going back to the scene from Castaway, where Tom Hanks first starts talking to Wilson the volleyball. I'm very sorry for this, Mr. Hanks. Now, I know there are some true crime purists out there who want just the facts, ma'am, and no levity in the podcast. Be assured, it is not my intention to insult anyone, and I definitely don't want to diminish any of the offenses I discuss. Little bits of comedy are strictly, used temporarily to lighten the mood on the heaviest of subjects. This is sometimes called graveyard humor, and it's a practice very commonly used among first responders dealing with the worst situations. I'm not saying they're cracking jokes in the middle of a shootout like in the movies, but when you're stuck in the aftermath of some of these atrocities for hours or even days, you'll do anything to take your mind to a better place. And in a much smaller example of this, researching, writing, discussing, and in your case, listening, sometimes needs a little bit, a lift out of the mire for a short while. Now, in my mind, interest and fascination with this subject matter is a much different thing than actual enjoyment of it. Now, let's wade back in. In the first mention of cannibalism, where the nickname Milwaukee Cannibal stemmed from, Dahmer placed Miller's heart, liver, biceps, and portions of leg flesh in the freezer for later consumption. Another example of escalating behavior, trying more and more taboo things for stimulation. Now, he's running out of taboos at this point as far as I'm concerned. Dahmer bleached and dried Miller's skeleton on a towel for a week, and then coated his skull in enamel, which I'm sure made it nice and shiny for his collection. So Dahmer must have been pleased with that. 3 weeks later, Dahmer was on the hunt again, but in a new location, the Grand Avenue Mall. He lured 22-year-old Dave Thomas, and I'm not talking about the Wendy's founder, back to his apartment for a paid photo shoot. After drugging Thomas and presumably undressing and inspecting him, Dahmer later stated he did not find him attractive. I wonder if this was a planned event or a split-second decision by Dahmer because he just happened to strike up a conversation with a receptive stranger. I guess in a way, Thomas was actually fortunate because since Dahmer didn't like him, he was just disposed of instead of having his remains further disgraced by becoming part of Dahmer's sick collection. Dahmer did, however, retain the photos he took of Thomas's dissection process. Now, after this less than satisfying attempt by Dahmer, you think he would immediately go out and find a more attractive victim. Instead, Dahmer had what was for him at this time an extended cooling off period of nearly 5 months before he killed again. And if you believe that a serial killer with Dahmer's frequency would simply sit in his apartment and control himself, you'd be very wrong. In most instances with serial killers, cool-off periods get shorter in length, not longer, as they progress. Most exceptions to this indicate some circumstance that impede the killer's habits, like incarceration for other crimes. And while you consider that Dahmer didn't kill for 5 months, He unsuccessfully attempted to lure men to his apartment no less than 5 times in that span. So he was just having a run of bad luck, let's call it that. Dahmer's probation officer got an earful during this time. Without an outlet, Dahmer complained of depression and anxiety about his sexuality, isolation, and poor finances, among other things. I'm sure that he left out that he cried himself to sleep every night after jerking off into a filing cabinet full of his victims' skulls. Now, Dahmer snapped his losing streak in February of 1991 when he again lowered his age cap and lured 17-year-old Curtis Straughter to his apartment for a nude photo shoot. This went about as well as you'd guess at this point. Dahmer drugged and strangled the poor kid. I guess this was a more thought-out abduction since Dahmer ended up liking Straughter enough to keep his skull, hands, and genitals. Once again, he photographed each stage of the dismemberment process. Less than 2 months later, Dahmer got bored with his normal routine and decided to step it up a bit. He now wondered if he could do away with the messy disposal process and instead create a live, submissive, quote-unquote zombie, which he could then do with what he wished. So he met and lured 19-year-old Errol Lindsay to his lair. After drugging Lindsay, Dahmer had the brilliant idea of drilling a hole in Lindsay's head and injecting hydrochloric acid into the brain with a turkey baster. Amazingly, Lindsay woke a short time later after complaining of the headache and asking what time it was. Obviously, a speaking zombie wasn't what Dahmer was expecting, and answering tedious questions didn't interest him. So he chalked this up to a failed experiment and, with his signature clinical detachment, drugged and strangled Lindsay. To make sure this wasn't a completely wasted venture, Dahmer not only retained Lindsay's skull, but also attempted to preserve his skin in a saltwater solution. This ultimately made the flesh brittle, and Dahmer disposed of it. By 1991, the mind-your-own-business philosophy of Dahmer's neighbors finally deteriorated to the point of multiple complaints to the building manager, Sopa Princewell. Now I'm sure by this time in his career, Princewell had heard about every gripe imaginable. Bad smells? Check. Banging and other noises? Check. The occasional use of a chainsaw? Let's hold the phone on that one. Like I've said in the past, human decomposition is unlike any other smell, even other decomposition. Think about it, if you really paid attention, you could probably even tell the difference between rotting fish and rotting meat. If Princewell had been a building manager for more than 2 weeks, he was probably perfectly familiar with the smell of human death. So on multiple occasions, when he accepted Dahmer's excuse of a broken freezer or his aquarium fish dying, I think his mind-your-own-business meter was either broken or off the chart. Who knows? He also may have been under orders from the owners to do everything possible to retain tenants. Now, whatever the case was, we know the smells and noises didn't diminish in the slightest, so for a time, Princewell did a lot of avoiding pissed-off tenants in the hallways. Not being dissuaded by his recent Dr. Frankenstein-like failure, Dahmer found his next victim in May of 1991. 31-year-old aspiring model Tony Hughes was lured from a nightclub with an offer of another paid photo shoot. Dahmer drugged Hughes and again tried to make a zombie by injecting hydrochloric acid into his brain. I am unsure as to the modification Dahmer made this time, but I assume it involved a greater amount of acid since Hughes did not survive the procedure. Now the escalation continues to a fever pitch. Only 2 days after killing Hughes and not yet even disposing of the body, Dahmer lured a 14-year-old boy to his lair. Now, Konarak, let me try to pronounce this, Synthesomphone, was a young Lao teenager who just happened to be the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had been convicted of molesting in 1988. How was that for a small world? You really have to wonder about this kid's home situation, since his brother's molestation didn't really have an impact on his don't talk to strangers instinct. Dahmer later stated Konarak was initially hesitant about his offer of paying for photographing him in his underwear, but eventually agreed. After a couple of photos were taken, Dahmer drugged Konarak and led him into the bedroom while still somewhat conscious. His state of mind and awareness had to be very diminished since he was walking past Tony Hughes's bloated and decaying body on the floor. Dahmer stated Conrad didn't respond at all. Dahmer performed oral sex on the boy as he fell into unconsciousness and then switched back into Dr. Frankenstein mode. He drilled a hole in Conrad's skull and injected hydrochloric acid into his frontal lobe. It would seem as though Dahmer had done some research over the last couple of days as to the injection site, or maybe he just got lucky, or potentially unlucky, as we'll see. After the brain surgery, Dahmer lay beside Conrad and drank beer. When he ran out of beer, he faced the dilemma most alcoholics do at some point. Do I go without, or do I make a questionable and sometimes risky decision to get more? As usual for alcoholics, Dahmer decided on the latter and left the apartment in search of booze. But Conrad was not dead. After drinking at a bar for a little bit, Dahmer returned home in the early hours of May 27th. Imagine his surprise as he approached his apartment building when he saw Conrad sitting naked on the curb, surrounded by 3 strange women who were rightfully distressed. Did Dahmer do the smart thing and remove himself from the situation, hoping the damage he caused Conrad's brain would either kill him or prevent him from backtracking to the apartment? Nope. He calmly walked up to the women and explained to them that the young man was a drunk friend of his, and even gave him an on-the-spot alias of John Mong. Thankfully, the women had already called 911 and prevented Dahmer from walking Conrad back into the apartment. Now, as a law enforcement official, this next part completely boggles my mind, but bear with me till the end. Milwaukee police officers John Balzarak and Joseph Gabrish arrived on scene and made contact with Dahmer and the upset women. Dahmer now begins to display absolutely sociopathic behavior in his manipulation of the situation. From reports, he was completely calm. Alcohol helps lowering, the inhibitions, but this is nuts. And explained to the officers that the youth was his 19-year-old boyfriend who was just drunk on Jack Daniels, and he had done this before. Dealing with an extremely drunk person who displays this kind of behavior was, of course, a pain in the ass for the officers. Excessive drunks routinely incur minor injuries in a variety of ways, falling, running through brush, etc. And into this situation walks the calm, rational boy next door who is willing to take custody of the poor soul. This is an angel from heaven for the officers, as they have been given an out and are now about to make the whole thing go away and get off shift. The alternative is they take custody of the guy, a paramedic puts a Band-Aid on his scraped knee, and then they put him in the back of the squad car where he begins to puke, piss, and shit his way all the way to the jail. It is absolutely horrible to say, but this situation was decided the moment Dahmer opened his mouth, and nothing was going to change those officers' minds. Don't finish being exasperated yet, because this event is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And since I don't want to lie to you and give you hope, it never gets better. As the officers were preparing to turn Conrad over to Dahmer, one of the now exasperated women who had called the police and tried to intervene, she pointed out that it wasn't just a scratched knee that the boy had, but injured testicles and a bleeding rectum. At this point, in the polite and respectful exchange between the officers and the women from a largely minority neighborhood, they were told to butt out, shut the hell up, and not to interfere. And I doubt it was even that cordial. Now, this was now a battle of wills where the officers had all the power and were probably now operating mostly out of spite. I will say that blinders were now firmly on, but you will not believe how quickly blinders can turn into absolute blindfolds. The fire department arrived and provided a blanket for Conrad. One of the firefighters wanted to treat Conrad's apparent minor injuries, but they were overridden by Officer Balzarak, who was more than ready to be done with this whole situation. Officer Richard Porobkan then arrived, and the decision was made to walk Conrad to Dahmer's apartment. Not that you could have possibly forgotten, but through all this, Conrad had been sitting there with a hole drilled into his head. Obviously, we don't know the exact condition Dahmer had left Conrad in when he left the apartment. Conrad was a teenager from Laos and had extremely dark hair. Even if Dahmer had not dressed the wound, a very small hole in the skull, maybe it clotted over, and dried blood may not have been evident. especially those, to someone who didn't want to see it. Now, believe it or not, in decades past, and not as far back as you'd like to think, domestic disputes that didn't have severe injuries didn't always end in an arrest. Fighting partners were often left to sort it out on their own homes or in their own homes, and officers had much less requirement to act to prevent further offenses. Thankfully, that has wildly swung in the opposite direction today. Also, a lack of recording equipment back then sometimes promoted less than honorable behavior. Keep in mind that everything we've been talking about here has been completely he said, she said, so it's probably only about 50% accurate at best. Now, our incredulity will rise to new heights as I tell you what happens next. The three officers dismissed the firefighters and the women who called 911 and walked Conorak to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer accompanied the officers, calmly commenting on the rising amount of crime in this poor neighborhood and his love of the police. Almost to the day, Dahmer had spent an entire year killing, dismembering, dissolving, boiling, preserving, and storing human beings in this small one-bedroom apartment, and now three supposedly experienced police officers were entering. No brainer, right? They recognized the unmistakable odor of death. They discovered the rotting corpse currently lying on the bedroom floor. They discovered the collection of body parts and photographs stored throughout the apartment, and immediately and heroically arrested Dahmer, thus miraculously saving Conorak's life and putting an end to a serial killer's horrible career. Wrong. They smelled what Gabrish later reported as excrement, and Balcerzak reported as nothing unusual. One of the officers even poked his head into the bedroom to locate the excrement smell and didn't notice the bloated corpse on the floor. Dahmer then calmly showed the officer the photos he had taken of an awake and willing Conorak in his underwear. Deciding that this was irrefutable proof of a homosexual relationship, they ominously told Dahmer to take good care of the boy and probably tripped over each other trying to get out of the apartment. The event was recorded as the good old standby domestic dispute. I personally have left more calls than I'd like to admit, thinking I might have missed something there. If none of those officers felt anything after leaving that apartment, they were the true zombies in this scenario. No shit. Well, unfortunately, Dahmer took the officer's sage advice to take good care of Conorak and injected a fatal dose of acid into his brain. He then disposed of Conorak and Hughes and retained their skulls. I've always tried to reserve judgment on officers' behaviors because I wasn't there, and there are usually more than two sides to every story. But there were enough independent witnesses at this scene, and even if you make every excuse imaginable, these officers still come up at the bottom of the barrel. Now, enough on that, and bless poor Conorak, who was within a breath of escaping apartment 213. Let's go on to June 30th. Dahmer traveled to Chicago and met 20-year-old Matt Turner at a bus station. He, again, lured him for a photo shoot, drugged and strangled him, and put his head and internal organs into plastic bags in the freezer. Now, 5 days later, Dahmer met 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger in a Chicago bar and lured him home to spend the weekend. Now he's starting to range further for victims. He's not just doing this in Milwaukee anymore. After drugging Weinberger, Dahmer twice injected boiling water into his brain. This put Weinberger into a coma, and he died 2 days later. On July 15th, Dahmer met 24-year-old Oliver Lacey and lured him home for another photo shoot. This time, Dahmer attempted to subdue Lacey with chloroform to retain him longer while alive. When this didn't work, he strangled Lacey and had sex with the corpse before dismembering it. This is another escalation and the first mention of necrophilia. After the dismemberment, Lacey's head and heart were put in the fridge and his skeleton was put in the freezer. And during this period of ramping up his killing, Dahmer was fired from his job for repeatedly calling in sick. Now, his life is starting to spiral out of control, and this is usually when a final frenzy, so to speak, begins and mistakes are made. As an example, if you lost your job and couldn't pay the rent on your corpse storage facility, what do? You immediately find another job to pay the bills. What did Dahmer do? He immediately lured another victim home, 25-year-old Joseph Breithoft. Now, after strangling Breithoft, he left him dying on the bed covered in a sheet, or left him on the bed covered in a sheet for 2 days. When he discovered the head had begun to infest with maggots, he cleaned it and placed it in the fridge. He then acidified Breithoft's torso with 2 others from the victim he had killed that month. Now let's move on to the blessed capture. On July 22nd, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men and offered $100 to pose for photos, drink beer, and just hang out. His caring about getting away with it was dwindling rapidly. He was approaching groups. He would leave 1 or 2 potential witnesses here. He was upping his bribe with money he probably didn't have at this point, and he was now simply begging for company. Just the last pathetic part of that now turns Dahmer into the prey instead of the hunter, since many strangers will see this as a weakness and take advantage. Not that there is anyone more deserving of it. One of the 3, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to Dahmer's offer and accompanied him back to the apartment. When he entered, he noticed the foul smell and boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor. Red flags. Dahmer told Edwards he used the acid for cleaning bricks, which I guess is a common pastime in Wisconsin. Now, when Dahmer directed Edwards to admire his tropical fish tank, he slapped a handcuff on Edwards' wrist. Another desperate escalation. This was not a helpless individual. Dahmer didn't even try to drug him with a laced drink. I almost suspect Dahmer's new financial situation saw him running low on booze and pills at this point. Whatever the reason, thankfully Dahmer was not able to get the second handcuff on. Edwards was keeping his calm and may have been in strange situations like this before. Maybe not this bad. Dahmer led Edwards into the bedroom for the photo shoot, and Edwards noticed a large 57-gallon drum in the corner. He stated an awful smell was emanating from it. Dahmer had a videotape playing continuously in the bedroom. The movie was, of course, The Exorcist 3. It's not a bad movie. I mean, ironically enough, it's about a serial killer possessed by the devil, so probably Dahmer's hero instead of Batman or Superman. When they got to the bed, Dahmer produced a knife and told Edwards they were going to shoot the nude photos now. Edwards, still with a cool head, unbuttoned his shirt and told Dahmer he would do the photos if he put the knife away and took off the handcuff. At this, Dahmer's attention slipped towards the movie playing on the bedroom TV, and he began to rock back and forth and slowly chant, really softly. Dahmer had put himself into a new and strange tactical position here. Edwards was not unconscious, and now that the cuffs and knife were out, Dahmer couldn't just say he was kidding and have another visit from the police. I think the rocking and chanting were his way of disassociating himself from the situation and psyching himself up for what was coming next. The violent killing of a capable grown man was far different from strangling a helpless unconscious person. I've also heard from other survivors of serial killers that they sometimes observe an actual physical change in the person when they enter monster mode. Things such as posture, expression, and even the killer's irises darkening. This may be some medical, physiological thing, but you can't help but think of like supernatural shit at this point. When Dahmer turned his attention back to Edwards lying on the bed, he placed his head against his chest and, while listening to his pulse, nonchalantly stated he was going to eat his heart. Now, I've stated before that Edwards had a cool head, but he should win some kind of ice block award for this shit. He kept talking to Dahmer, trying to convince him he was his friend and he wasn't going to leave. He eventually talked Dahmer back to the living room couch, because there was air conditioning in there. Now, after asking to go to the bathroom, Dahmer consented, and when he let go of the handcuffs, Edwards punched him in the face and ran out the front door. A short distance away, Edwards located Officer Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller. I think the entire Milwaukee PD was staffed with Germans and Vikings. Edwards told the officer he had been held hostage by a freak for 5 hours, and when they were unable to remove his handcuff with their keys, he agreed to accompany them back to the apartment. Thankfully, this time the officers were going to investigate an actual crime and knocked on the door of apartment 213. Had Dahmer fled the location and began his life on the run, possibly going to his father for money before he disappeared? No. He answered the door and politely invited the three in. Absolute sociopath who's convinced of his own abilities, or a pathetic soul who's resigned to his fate. Dahmer admitted to putting the handcuff on Edwards and told the officer the key was in his bedside dresser. Oops. When Officer Mueller moved towards the bedroom to look for it, Dahmer suddenly realized there were multiple dead bodies in there and attempted to push past him. Now, this is a major safety no-no for police. Hopefully none of you have ever had occasion to physically touch an officer on duty, but if you have, you know the rest. Now, these officer red flag alarms must have already been screaming at this point, especially since the slight excrement smell the previous officers had mentioned had intensified into a taste now and had been simmering for a long time. To quote the lovely and talented Deadpool, like Mama Cass after hot yoga. Officer Routh probably gently moved Dahmer away from Mueller and told him to back off. When Mueller entered the bedroom, he observed the knife Edwards had mentioned near the bed. He also noticed an open drawer containing lots of Polaroid pictures, which probably stunned him silent. I can't imagine any of you would want to defend Dahmer at this point, but just in case there are some legal hobbyists out there. Because of Edwards' statement and condition, the officers were supposed to be at apartment 213. Dahmer invited them in and then admitted to handcuffing Edwards. Dahmer could and probably should have been in his own set of handcuffs by now. If not for the safety because of the alleged knife, then because he had already admitted to a felony. But since he wasn't under arrest yet, the officers can still do a safety sweep for weapons. But they can't go opening closed drawers, cabinets, etc., since he was directed to the key and the possibility of the knife in the bedroom. The officer could enter, also to make sure no one else was in there. Dahmer attempted to go past the officer into the bedroom, but didn't verbally forbid him from entering. Once Mueller saw the knife, he could collect it for safety or evidence, and when he saw the open drawer, he didn't have to touch it to see the Polaroids. This is called plain view. Now back to the Polaroids he did find. They were of Dahmer's victims during their death posing and dismemberment. The backdrop in the photos showed they were taken in this apartment. So Mueller then stumbles out of the bedroom and tells Roth, "These are for real." And when Dahmer saw the Polaroids, his weird sociopathic bubble finally burst and he tried to escape. That didn't go well, and the Vikings cuffed him on the floor. Dahmer muttered, "For what I did, I should be dead. No shit." Now the ghastly inventory. The vast majority of cops and crime scene technicians never see anything like apartment 213, even during 20 or 30-year careers. Eric, spelled with a K, the crime scene tech, probably woke up in his Viking longhouse that morning and figured maybe he would have to deal with a burglary, a robbery, maybe even a suicide or murder if his burnt offerings hadn't been good enough the night before. But no, he gets apartment 213. Here's a list of what he handled that day. 4 severed heads in Dahmer's kitchen, probably awaiting the defleshing process. 7 skulls in the bedroom and closet, some bleached and some painted. Inside the fridge, there were 2 hearts and a portion of an arm in plastic bags, probably prepping these for a meal. Says for months most of the contents of Dahmer's fridge were a leaking mess. The entire drain pan at the bottom was filled with human blood. In the freezer, they found an entire torso, as well as a bag of organs and flesh stuck to the bottom. Now, upon seeing this, Eric turns to the other crime scene tech and says, "Hey, Wolfgar, when you're done fixing your long, straight blonde hair, can I borrow your hairdryer? I need to defrost this bag of human viscera." Now, they also found 2 entire skeletons, 2 pairs of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, and a mummified scalp. And now to the infamous stinky 57-gallon drum in the corner of the bedroom. I bet they either drew straws or did rock, paper, scissors to see who opened it. And I bet Eric lost. Anyway, he was forced to look at 3 more torsos stewing in an acid solution. I'm no scientist, but I'm pretty sure when things are dissolving in acid, they heat up. So I bet Eric never ate any kind of stew again after that. The last significant thing taken from apartment were 74 Polaroids depicting the dismemberment process of Dahmer's victims. The contents of 213 were so many and so disgusting, there's a famous photo of private hazardous material contractors in full body protective gear, including portable air supplies, wheeling out the 57-gallon drum on a dolly. The chief medical examiner ultimately compared the processing of apartment 213 to dismantling a museum. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, but off the top of my head, the only collection more impressive than Dahmer's was from decades earlier by Mr. Ed Gein, who I'll probably cover in another episode. Funnily enough, though, Gein was also from Wisconsin, so that proud state holds the top 2 spots of human remains collections. Congratulations. On to the confession. On July 23, 1991, Dahmer began his interrogation with the lucky detectives Patrick Kennedy and Dennis Murphy. Dahmer waived his right to an attorney and began a confession which took more than 60 hours over 2 weeks. Dahmer admitted to killing 17 people in Wisconsin and Ohio. He didn't remember actually killing 12 men in the hotel room, although he did speculate that in a drunken stupor, he may have tried to rip out his heart with his bare hands and killed him in the process. Yeah, that would do it. To pile on to the already disgusting evidence collected in apartment 213, Dahmer added a few bits of insider information only he would know. Up to now, we've only had one mention of Dahmer committing necrophilia. In his confession, he not only admits to performing this act several times, but also to raping the victim's viscera as he was dismembering them in the bathtub. That's right, fucking guts. His process was not unlike dressing a deer. He removed all the internal organs and suspended the body to drain the blood before paring the flesh off. He then began to pick and choose the organs and flesh he wished to keep for eating and diced up the rest. He would separate the skulls and bones he wished to keep for display and pulverize or acidify the rest. He would also use normal condiments and cooking methods to tenderize the flesh and organs before cooking. When asked why he collected all the body parts, Dahmer not only told the detectives of his ultimate home decorating goal, but provided them with a drawing of the altar he wished to create. Now, since this is a podcast, I'll describe it as Dahmer did. Just picture any satanic altar you can think of from the movies. This display of skulls on a black table was to be adorned at each side with the complete skeletons of Miller and Lacey. The 4 severed heads found in his kitchen were to have all flesh removed and used in this altar, as was the skull of at least one future victim. Incense sticks were to be placed at each end of the black table, above which Dahmer intended to place a large blue lamp with extending blue globe lights. The entire construction was to be placed before a window covered with a black, opaque shower curtain, in front of which Dahmer intended to sit in a black leather chair. The horrible pun, "Eat your heart out, Martha Stewart," springs to mind. I'm sorry about that. Let's move on to the indictment. Dahmer was ultimately charged in Wisconsin for 15 counts of murder. He was not charged with the attempted murder of Edwards, nor was he charged with Tuomi's murder. There was no physical evidence of that crime, and Dahmer couldn't actually remember the killing. I'm sure prosecutors saw no need to add these charges to Dahmer's list in an already slam dunk case. One way or another, Dahmer would never be able to kill again. Had Dahmer retained a lawyer during his 60-hour confession, I'm sure that person would have completely lost his voice telling Dahmer to shut up. When he did get an attorney, the unlucky guy was the attorney we mentioned earlier, Gerald Boyle. I only say unlucky in the sense of being handed a virtually unwinnable case. However, as we see with many of the attorneys of famous serial killers, these cases usually begin their dubious fame and financial windfall, media appearances, book deals, so forth. Unlike some, I don't have a huge problem with this profiteering. Small-time attorneys and public defenders who have to spend a massive amount of intimate time with these monsters and then vigorously defend them should be compensated. I like to believe that most defense lawyers at least begin their careers with a desire to help innocent people. Being forced into a defense of a tremendously guilty person by law would have a negative effect on even the strongest person's conscience and morals. I do, however, think that a law giving a portion of these proceeds should always be distributed to the victims' families. I know there are many cases of limiting or prohibiting the killers from profiting, from their fame, but a defense attorney should also be under that umbrella, since they're usually privy to the most private and, should I say, marketable information. Now on to the trial. So ultimately, Doyle did what he could. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane to all counts. Once again, and as usual, when an insanity defense is used, we have to refer to the McNaughton rule. I'll read it, and we'll probably have to read it in every podcast I make in its original form. That every man is to be presumed to be sane, and that to establish a defense on the ground of insanity, it must be clearly proved that, at the time of the committing of the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason, from disease of the mind, as to not know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know he was doing what was wrong. There it is, and so once again, a defense has to convince a jury that in a mental state where he was completely out of touch with reality, Dahmer prepped, hunted, killed, concealed, and disposed of evidence for more than 10 years so as not to be caught. To prove that even though the acts themselves scream of conscious acts to avoid detection, you didn't know they were wrong? No way in hell. So, the trial began on January 30th, 1992 at Judge Lawrence Graham's court. It lasted 2 weeks. Let that 2 weeks sink in. Even though Dahmer had admitted to all the crimes and pleaded guilty, people were going to talk for probably close to 100 hours about his mental state. I have to hand it to Doyle for providing a vigorous defense. Now, having said that, I once again will not bore you with a step-by-step recounting of the entire trial. I'll just hit the highlights, so to speak. First, as I've said in my previous podcast, that a trial is a popularity contest, and the jury is the judge of that contest. They spend a massive amount of time looking at the defendant and judging his look, demeanor, and most importantly, his reaction to the horrific things he or she has done. Dahmer had a leg up in this department. He sat there looking like a slightly older version of the kid who mows your lawn, delivers your newspaper on his bike, or possibly took your daughter to prom. He has stated and displays some guilt for his crimes and looks engaged in the trial process. Unfortunately, virtually no psychiatrists sit on the juries because they would immediately identify Dahmer's sociopathic traits. He had one goal: save his own life by being declared insane. As usual, both sides rolled out a parade of expert witnesses, psychiatrists, and psychologists, and as usual, even though all of these learned men and women study the exact same science, they always give conflicting diagnoses for the exact same subject, based on whose side they're on. Now, the word diagnosis comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. I think in these cases, diagnosis should be replaced with diadoxa, because doxa is Greek for opinion. What the hell is Greek for paycheck anyway? So after going cross-eyed reading the court transcript, I'll boil it down to just one statement made by a prosecution witness, Dr. Fred Fostel. Dahmer's lust overpowered his morals. Now that's it. On February 15th, the jury found Dahmer sane and guilty of all 15 murders. There were reportedly 2 jury members who registered their dissent, but went along with the verdict. Undoubtedly, they were the 2 most sheltered jury members who couldn't come to grips with what people are actually capable of. The sentencing was put off till February 17th, since his original hope of an insanity verdict was now gone. Dahmer was afforded 2 days to switch sociopathic gears and write a heartfelt statement. In this statement, Dahmer emphasized that he had never desired freedom following his arrest and that he frankly wished for his own death. He further stressed that none of his murders had been motivated by hatred, that he understood that nothing he either said or did could undo the terrible harm he had caused to the families of his victims and the city of Milwaukee, and that he and his doctors believed his criminal behavior had been motivated by mental disorders. Dahmer added that his medical knowledge had given him some peace, and that although he understood that society would never forgive him, he hoped God would. Dahmer closed his statement with, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I've done. Thank you, Your Honor, and I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration." He then returned to his seat to await formal sentencing. Now, by my count, in this just abbreviated version of this statement, there are more than 10 self-serving references to himself, and only one mention of a victim as a whole, no individual references, as well as apologizing to the city of Milwaukee, a non-judgmental entity. Sociopath, okay. Sentence. Fortunately for Dahmer, Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853, so Judge Graham sentenced him to 15 life sentences plus 90 years, just in case. In an Ohio hearing that lasted only 45 minutes, Dahmer was given another life sentence for his original murder of Stephen Hicks. I know this conviction seems like an afterthought, but it served two purposes. It obviously validates what Dahmer did for Hicks's family and gives them some closure. It's also a safeguard in case a great, cheese poisoning epidemic turns every person in Wisconsin crazy and they vacate Dahmer's sentences. Now, cheese epidemics aside, after a 10-minute private goodbye session with his father, Lionel, Dahmer was shipped off to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Prison time. Okay. Dahmer was an infamous national media sensation by this point, and the prison officials decided to put him in solitary confinement for his first year, as some other inmate tried to take revenge or make a name for himself. After the year was up, Dahmer was moved to a less secure unit at his request, where he could interact with other inmates. He was even allowed a 2-hour daily work detail where he cleaned the bathroom and gymnasium areas. Now, also having turned to religion and being baptized while incarcerated, Dahmer spent time in the prison chapel. On July 3, 1994, while he sat in the chapel, another inmate, Osvaldo DeRuthi, attempted to slash his throat with an improvised weapon consisting of a toothbrush and a razor blade. He received only superficial wounds from this attack. Now, you would think that he would now want to be back in solitary confinement, but he had already confided to his family and the prison chaplain that he was ready to die. Whether this was truly his newfound religion convincing him, that he deserved punishment is anybody's guess. I personally believe that he was depressed and suicidal due to the prospect of living the rest of his life unable to do what he wanted most, satisfying his sexual desires through the destruction of another human being. Imagine that from this day forward, you are never again allowed any type of sexual release at all, no matter how horny you are. For most people with normal sexual urges, that would suck. Now consider the lengths and extremes Dahmer's went through to satisfy himself. Multiply your normal urges many times over. It could definitely take away a significant reason for that person to go on living. We exist in large part to procreate, obviously. Anyway, Dahmer remained in the less secure unit and continued on as he had. That was until November 28, 1994. He left his cell that morning and proceeded to his work detail with inmates Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. By the way, Scarver was a diagnosed schizophrenic who was also serving life for murder. For some unknown reason, the three men were left unsupervised for 20 minutes that morning. A guard observed Scarver return alone to his cell. Scarver told the guard that he had just killed Dahmer and Anderson. He said God told him to do it. Dahmer and Anderson were found in the shower and inmate locker room areas with severe head injuries. Anderson was dead and Dahmer died an hour later in hospital, never regaining consciousness. Scarver stated that Dahmer never made a sound as he was attacked. Do you remember what Dahmer's first victim was attacked with? A metal bar from a dumbbell. Can you guess what Dahmer was killed with? A metal bar from the gymnasium. Call it fate, call it luck, call it karma. I believe that everything happens for a reason. I believe that Dahmer was destined to get his head caved in by a dumbbell bar. Scarver didn't claim to know any specifics about Dahmer's crimes. I thought it was it was kind of poetic. What about you? Let's wrap this up. I'm out of whiskey. Now, I was talking to one of the young men who helps in my physical therapy the other day. Jake is his name. Jake, as it turns out, is a true crime fan and listens to my podcast, and so I asked him, if you had a choice, what serial killer would you like to hear about next? He had no hesitation and immediately said Gacy. For those of you that don't know anything about John Wayne Gacy, I'll risk a little spoiler. You know how Dahmer had 17 victims? Pretty much double that for Gacy. Considering how long it took me to research and prepare this script, I'm beginning to think Jake may have some sadistic tendencies. I truly hope you found this podcast informative and entertaining, and I know I've ripped on Wisconsin a lot in the last hour or two. So I'll try to make up for it now by saying that Vince Lombardi was an extremely handsome man. All right, everyone. Be good and behave. My name is Brian, and I look forward to joining you in the next Mad Cardigan Crime.